First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to share an idea worth spreading. As you heard, my name is Sinit Zeru. I work with governments on policies that are designed to heal social problems and to enable societies to thrive. Policymakers like me deal with a wide range of issues and challenges. A village needs water, people need work opportunities, a country's economy needs to grow. But in a complex world, trying to solve complex problems, there are some solutions that do not succeed as intended. And it's not because people don't care, or there aren't enough resources, or the technology isn't there, or we didn't prioritize it. Sometimes all these pieces are in place, and still, we don't get the success that we hoped for. And I believe that part of that problem is because we have misunderstood the problem from the very beginning. We defined it too narrowly, we listened too late, we forced complexity into yes or no categories, and sometimes we just haven't used the right lens to fully understand what's going on. This is tragic. To have an important social goal, to dedicate precious resources, and to still not deliver. I believe we cannot heal complex societies with some of the default thinking we often fall into. And I want to share with you today 4 principles that I use to challenge common default assumptions that can trap us. And by following these principles, I hope that we can generate better solutions to these worthwhile challenges. So my first principle is always assume exclusion. Do not ask only what is the problem. Ask who got to define the problem. Usually, when we're dealing with complex issues and complex challenges, we start with well-established sources, universities, research institutions, international organizations, experts, and all of that is important because evidence matters, rigorous academic thinking matters, but I want to invite us to look around the physical or metaphorical room and ask, who is missing? Because inclusion often comes too late in the game. By the time we bring affected communities into the conversations, many assumptions have already been built into the definition of the challenge. The rail tracks have already been set, and then inclusion becomes a minor adjustment rather than a fundamental driver of design. A useful and well-documented case study is the Play Pump project in South Africa. The idea was brilliant. In rural communities where women had to spend a lot of time and do physical hard work to collect water daily, a water pump designed as a children's merry-go-round could kill 2 birds. Children would have a space designed for play. As the merry-go-round was used, it would pump water, and it would save hardworking women the physical burden of collecting that water. It attracted major support and millions of dollars from well-meaning organizations. It was well-resourced, it was a meaningful problem to solve, smart people were around the table, and yet it didn't work as intended. There were several challenges, but one of the challenges was that the daily practice of getting water was space and time for these women to come together. It was an opportunity for them to counsel each other, for them to step away from the home. And in addition, many of these rural communities were not significantly dissatisfied with the current water pump systems that they had. And the problem was that it had been defined largely by people on the outside. The women were seen as beneficiaries to the solution, but they were not placed at the very center of solving the problem. And this is why this first principle is so important. So I always ask, not just what is the problem, but who gets to define it? And practically what that looks like is, whose work are you reading? What is their experience? Who funded this work? Who did they get to speak to? And compare that to the audience you're serving. Outside and new perspectives are valuable precisely because they drive innovative solution. But innovative is not always the same as effective. So, principle number 1, assume exclusion as you start and proactively design to eliminate it. Principle number 2 is assume complexity and make informed, intentional simplifications. Simple ideas are persuasive, they're easy to explain, easy to get buy-in, easy to fund, easy to design slogans around. And as we have access to more information, more data, more social media, we are at the risk of being overwhelmed by it. And the seductiveness of simple, short, slogan-like thinking has increased. But the more meaningful the question, the more transformative you want your intervention to be, the bigger the population you want to impact, the less likely it is to fit into neat categories. Even things we think of as clear and final, like what does it mean for a living thing to be considered dead? They're not simple. As medical technology has advanced, as we have a better understanding of what's going on, doctors have evolved more complex language like cardiac death, brain death. There are so many multiple levels. So if something as straightforward, or what appears to be straightforward, like death can become complex, we really have to be humble about almost everything else. In policy, we often have to make categories. Eligible or ineligible, fit for work or not fit for work, successful or unsuccessful, safe or unsafe. And categories are often necessary because spectrums, especially for large populations, can be really costly to implement. Governments have limited time, limited budget, and urgent decisions to make. But my argument is that while simplifications are necessary, they have to be intentional, not accidental. And I want to share with you another case study. So in 2008, in the UK, something called the Work Capability Assessment was introduced. It was meant to determine entitlement to benefits that help cover living costs for people who couldn't work because of a disability or a health condition. The thinking was, let's ensure that limited benefits go to those who need it the most, and also that we want to incentivize those who can work to work. Unfortunately, a case study by King's College highlights one of the major challenges, which was underestimating the complexity of mental health conditions and the way in which they impair people's capacity to work. Not only are mental health issues typically less visible, many are very context-specific. They're fluctuating, they depend on life circumstances, they really depend on the kind of job that we're asking people to do. In addition, the very process of the assessment itself was found by many to be incredibly stressful. So a known population that was dealing with mental health issues was put under extreme stress, which seems to completely go against the real value and intention of the project. So when we implement solutions intended to make the world better, fairer, more sustainable, there are pragmatic compromises that we will likely need to be made. The lesson is when we simplify complex human experiences, we should know exactly what we are simplifying, who may be harmed, and what the cost is in the long run. So we make the best possible compromises. So the second principle is, don't make simple or pragmatic positions the starting point. Assume there is complexity that deserves understanding and simplify with intention. My third principle is about the way we look at the big picture. Individuals, households, governments have finite resources and time. There are competing demands. Many things are important, but we don't always have the resources to go around. And we've all heard the principle, look at the big picture. But I want to invite you to apply a more nuanced approach, and that is look at the big picture and be aware of the lens that you are applying. None of us are neutral, nor should we be. It's good that you come to the table with your values, with your experiences, with your quirks. The danger is when you are blind to them. And It's also dangerous to assume that just because something has scientific experiment or a data-driven study as part of its title, somehow it's objective or neutral. Even if we agree on facts and numbers, we may not agree on what should have been measured or what the data actually means in terms of how we should prioritize it for resources. There's been a really positive trend for some time amongst government policymakers to incorporate a way of assessing priorities that are not based exclusively on big economic or political lenses. Now more and more governments are talking about well-being, human flourishing, healing, and even the happiness of citizens, not as an afterthought, but as a core driver of policy. Bhutan is a well-recognized front-runner, having introduced the concept of national gross happiness in the 1970s, so they were well ahead of the game. New Zealand introduced a well-being budget in 2019, asking how public spending could be assessed to address long-term well-being priorities. Just a decade ago, the UAE introduced a Minister of State for Happiness. I mean, what a great job title that is, much better than mine. Their role is to strategically integrate happiness metrics into public policy. It's still a nascent trend, but the growing shift towards focusing on other values beyond GDP or employment rates legitimizes resourcing for these important areas. And it gives important attention to things like environmental policy, mental well-being, culture. So my third principle is assume your lens is biased and incomplete. Apply multiple lenses as you look at the big picture and really pick the lens that has the values that are meaningful to the issue. These first three principles are what I call thinking principles. And the final principle I want to share with you is what I call a feeling principle. And it's probably the toughest one, but arguably the most valuable one. So my final principle is feel compassion as you learn. There's a growing body of research around the importance of compassion for our mental health, for our practical capacity to be in service of others. And compassion is not sympathy or pity. It's fundamentally about recognizing humanity in others and honoring the dignity of others. A pragmatic way I find to practice compassion is to start with the default belief that everyone is doing the best that they know to do. That is not about denying malicious intent, unkind behavior, or to diminish moral culpability. Rather, it's about moving away from judgment, because when we begin from judgment, we close our minds off to learning. But when we begin from compassion and looking at the people we want to serve, the people we need to debate, the people we need to compete with, we can separate those people from a particular behavior or a belief. We can be curious and ask better questions. What incentives shape this action? What did they not know? What fear was operating here? And what did the system reward? In treating people compassionately, you make space for potential solutions, potential change. We can have compassion for the well-meaning people behind the projects that don't quite work. We can have compassion for people designing difficult welfare systems, and also for the very people who are subject to those systems. We need compassion for ourselves, because if we are serious about healing the world, we will make mistakes, we will misunderstand things, we will listen too late, we will oversimplify. The aim is to make sure we are learning to be better as we go. So challenging these default ways of thinking and applying these principles will help us to do this. So I invite all of you, when you're defining a problem, assume inclusion, and ask who is missing and endeavor to have their voices heard. Assume complexity in the experiences you seek to understand, and make the necessary simplifications from an informed and intentional place. When looking at the big picture, assume your lens is incomplete and focus on the values that you want to embed in the way that you view the world. And finally, when people don't get it right, including ourselves, learn with compassion and not judgment. Thank you very much for your time.